Lyra's hands trembled as she stood in the diplomatic chamber, watching the human delegation arrive through the crystalline gates. Her father, High Chancellor Varen of the Ascended Collective, had made his decision 3 cycles ago. One of his daughters would marry a human to seal the peace treaty, ending the war that had consumed 17 star systems. Lyra had volunteered before her sisters could be forced into it. She told herself it was duty. She told herself it was honor. The truth was simpler and darker. She was terrified, and she wanted to face that terror on her own terms. The humans had appeared in their space 5 years ago, emerging from a region everyone believed was empty. They had no dimensional shields, no plasma cores, no connection to the ethereal streams that powered every advanced civilization. They used explosives and kinetics, fired metal projectiles at relativistic speeds, and built their ships from steel and determination. When the Collective's fleet had tried to push them back, confident in their technological superiority, 300 warships had been reduced to debris in 4 hours. The humans didn't just fight. They calculated, adapted, and executed with a precision that seemed impossible for beings who couldn't even sense the quantum fields. The human ambassador entered first, a woman named Claire Murphy, with grey hair and eyes like frozen oceans. Behind her walked 7 others, but Lyra's gaze fixed on the man in the rear. He was tall by human standards, perhaps 6 feet, with dark hair cut military short and a face that revealed nothing. His name was Daniel Cross, a commander in something called the Terran Expeditionary Marines. He wore a simple uniform, dark blue with silver insignia, and moved with the contained efficiency of someone always aware of every exit and threat vector. Claire spoke first, her voice measured and professional. "Chancellor Varen, the Terran Council accepts your proposal. Commander Cross has volunteered for this assignment. He is a decorated officer, 20 years of service, and comes from a family with strong diplomatic traditions." The words were diplomatic noise. Lyra knew what this really was. The humans were sending a weapon wrapped in a wedding suit, someone who could protect their interests and report everything back to Earth. Fine, the Collective was doing the same thing. She was no helpless princess. She had trained in strategic combat and political theory since childhood. She could handle 1 human. The ceremony happened within hours. No celebration, no grand ritual. Just words spoken in 2 languages, documents signed with both digital encryption and old-fashioned ink, and rings exchanged. Daniel's hand was warm when he slipped the band onto her finger, his touch careful and controlled. His eyes met hers for just a moment, and she saw something there that unsettled her more than aggression would have. Patience. He looked at her the way a scientist might examine an interesting equation. Curious, but not cruel. They were given quarters in the diplomatic tower, a suite with separate chambers and a shared common area. Lyra retreated to her room immediately after the ceremony, her heart pounding in a rhythm that betrayed her fear. Through the wall, she heard nothing. The human made no sound at all. Hours passed. She finally emerged, driven by hunger and pride in equal measure, to find Daniel sitting at the central table with a small device in his hands. He looked up as she entered. "There's food in the storage unit," he said, his voice deeper than she expected. "I didn't know what your species preferred, so I ordered a variety." His accent was strange, flattening some sounds and sharpening others, but his command of the Collective's language was flawless. She moved to the storage unit and found it stocked with both human and ascended cuisine. A small gesture, but it was the first moment she realized he might be more than just a soldier playing diplomat. "You speak our language well," she said, filling a plate with crystal fruits and protein gel. "I've had 5 years to learn," Daniel replied. "Your people have been trying to kill mine for most of that time. Seemed worth the effort to understand you." There was no anger in his voice, just statement of fact. Lyra sat across from him, maintaining the proper distance. "And now we're married," she said. "Yes." He set his device down. "I want to make something clear. I didn't volunteer for this because I wanted an alien wife or because I'm some kind of spy, though I'm sure your intelligence services think otherwise. I volunteered because I've seen what war does, and I'm tired of it. If this arrangement can help end the killing, then it's worth it." He leaned back, and for the first time, she saw fatigue in his features. I won't pretend we're going to be happy. I won't pretend this isn't political theatre, but I will treat you with respect, and I'll do my part to make this work. That's all I can promise. Lyra studied him, searching for deception and finding only exhaustion. Why do you fight so well? She asked. Your technology is inferior. You shouldn't have lasted a month against us. Daniel smiled, but there was no humour in it, because we've been fighting ourselves for our entire history. Every weapon, every tactic, every strategy you've used against us, we invented it first and used it on each other. You're advanced, princess. But you've never had to be desperate. He stood, moving toward his chamber. Get some rest. Tomorrow they'll want us to make public appearances. Smile for the cameras and pretend we're the future of peace. He disappeared into his room, and Lyra sat alone in the silence, her food forgotten. For the first time since volunteering for this arrangement, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, not because the human was cruel or dangerous in the way she had expected, but because he had revealed something she hadn't considered. The humans weren't just warriors. They were survivors of a crucible she couldn't imagine, shaped by centuries of conflict against themselves. And now one of them was her husband, living in her home, watching everything with those patient, calculating eyes. She touched the ring on her finger and felt the weight of more than metal. The first public appearance happened at dawn, human time, which the collective had begun adopting for diplomatic meetings. Lyra wore formal robes in deep blue, marked with the silver threads that denoted her royal status. Daniel appeared in his dress uniform, dark and severe, with rows of coloured ribbons on his chest that meant nothing to her but everything to humans who understood military decoration. They stood together on a balcony overlooking the capital city of Axios Prime, while cameras broadcast their image across both human and collective space. Claire Murphy stood beside them, reading a prepared statement about unity and the future. Lyra barely heard the words. She was too aware of Daniel standing exactly 1 foot to her right, close enough to appear united, but far enough to maintain professional distance. His face revealed nothing, a mask of diplomatic neutrality that she was beginning to recognize as his default expression. When Claire finished, she gestured for them to join hands. Protocol demanded it. Lyra extended her hand, and Daniel took it, his grip firm but not aggressive. Flash captures fired from 100 angles, preserving the moment for history. Smile, Daniel murmured, barely moving his lips. You look like you're attending a funeral. Perhaps I am, Lyra replied in the same subtle way, but she adjusted her expression to something more pleasant. They held the pose for another minute before Claire mercifully ended the session. As they turned to leave, Lyra noticed Daniel's shoulders relax fractionally. So he hated this too. That was something, at least. A shared misery. The next week established a routine: morning appearances for the media, afternoon meetings with various diplomatic teams from both sides, evenings alone in their quarters. Daniel spent most of his free time with his portable devices, reading reports and maintaining contact with his own people. Lyra studied collective intelligence assessments and tried to learn more about the humans through official channels, which told her almost nothing useful. On the 8th day, her sister Kira visited, arriving with the kind of dramatic announcement that made guards scramble. Kira was younger by 2 cycles and had always been the bold one, the one who said what everyone else thought but dared not speak. He swept into the common area like a storm, her silver robes billowing, and stopped short when she saw Daniel sitting calmly at the table, eating something that looked like preserved meat. "So this is the human," Kira said in their language, making no effort to be polite. "I expected something more impressive. He looks almost normal." "Kira, this is Commander Daniel Cross, my husband," Lyra said, switching to the collective language deliberately. "Daniel, my sister, Princess Kira." Daniel stood, setting his food aside, and nodded respectfully. "Princess." Then, in perfect collective formal speech, he added, "Your sister speaks highly of you. I'm honored to meet you." Kira's eyes widened slightly. Not many humans bothered to learn formal speech patterns. "You've studied our customs." "I've tried," Daniel replied, "though I'm sure I make mistakes. Your language has 17 tenses for future probability. English has 3, and we barely use those correctly." Despite herself, Lyra felt a flicker of something like pride. He was handling Kira's hostility with grace, deflecting without confrontation. Kira circled him slowly, studying him the way one might examine a dangerous animal in a containment field. "They say your people can't sense the quantum fields," Kira said, "that you're blind to the fundamental forces that govern reality. How does it feel to be so limited?" "Frustrating," Daniel answered without hesitation, "especially when those fields are being used to target weapons at our ships. We've had to develop workarounds, mathematics mostly. We can't sense the fields, but we can measure their effects and predict their patterns. It's slower, less elegant, but it works." "You calculate what we simply know," Kira said, "and yet you've destroyed fleets that should have crushed you. How?" Daniel met her gaze directly. "Because we assume everything can kill us, and we plan accordingly. Your commanders relied on technological superiority. Ours assumed they were outmatched and planned for it. When you have fewer advantages, you learn to use them more efficiently." Kira was quiet for a moment, then laughed, a sharp sound that held no amusement. "Father chose well. You're not just a soldier, you're a survivor." She turned to Lyra. "Be careful, sister. This one thinks 3 moves ahead." After Kira left, Lyra found Daniel back at the table, returning to his meal as if nothing had happened. "You handled that well," she said. "Your sister was testing me," Daniel replied, "seeing if I was a threat or a fool. It's what I would do." He paused, chewing thoughtfully. "She cares about you. That's why she came. Wanted to make sure you were safe." "How do you know that?" "Because I have 3 sisters," Daniel said, "and they would do the same thing if our positions were reversed. Probably with more violence, honestly. You Ascended are actually quite polite compared to a cross-family dinner." It was the first personal thing he had shared, and Lyra felt something shift between them. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "You miss them," she said, "every day." He met her eyes. "But I'm here, and I'll see this through." That's what soldiers do. The next morning brought news that shattered their careful routine. A collective patrol ship had fired on a human freighter near the border zone, killing 15 crew members. The humans claimed it was unprovoked. The collective insisted the freighter had been in restricted space. Within hours, both fleets were mobilizing, and the fragile peace that Lyra and Daniel represented began to crack. High Chancellor Varen summoned them to the council chamber, where collective military leaders stood on one side and human diplomatic staff on the other. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Claire Murphy was arguing with Admiral Torrin, the collective's fleet commander, while junior officers from both sides watched with hands near their weapons. "This marriage was supposed to prevent incidents like this," Torrin said, his voice cold. "Instead, we have dead humans and accusations flying. Perhaps the Terran Council isn't as committed to peace as they claimed." "Or perhaps your trigger-happy patrol captains need better training," Claire shot back. "Our freighter was in neutral space, exactly where the treaty allows. Your people fired first and asked questions, never." Daniel stepped forward, his movement drawing every eye in the room. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of command. "Admiral Torrin, with respect, I was a ship captain before I was a Marine. I know how border incidents happen. Someone misreads sensors, someone panics, someone makes a bad call. The question isn't who fired first. The question is whether we're going to let 15 dead become 15,000. Torrin turned his full attention to Daniel, and Lyra saw the Admiral's expression shift from anger to calculation. "You presume to lecture me on military matters, human?" "No, sir," Daniel replied. "I presume to offer perspective from someone who has seen this exact scenario play out before on both sides. 3 years ago, a collective scout ship entered what we considered our space. My captain wanted to fire immediately. I convinced him to hail them first. Turned out their navigation systems had malfunctioned. We escorted them back to the border, and nobody died. 2 months later, a human destroyer got lost in a quantum eddy. and ended up in your territory. Your commander could have destroyed it. Instead, he helped us recover it. That captain's name was Sella. He saved 400 lives that day." The room went quiet. Admiral Torren's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise. "You know of Captain Sella?" "I made it my business to know," Daniel said, "because officers like him are the reason this peace has a chance. And officers like the ones who ordered today's firing are the reason it might fail. We need an investigation led by both sides with full transparency. Find out what actually happened, hold people accountable if necessary, and show both our peoples that this treaty means something." Chancellor Verin, who had been silent until now, spoke from his raised platform. "Commander Cross makes a valid point. We will launch a joint investigation immediately. Admiral Torren, you will cooperate fully with human observers. Claire Murphy, your people will do the same with ours. We will have answers within 3 days." The meeting dispersed, slowly, with both sides eyeing each other warily. As Lyra and Daniel left the chamber, she pulled him aside into a private corridor. "That was risky," she said. "You could have made things worse." "Could have," Daniel agreed. "But someone needed to offer a way forward. That wasn't escalation. Your admiral was ready to use this as an excuse to resume hostilities. Claire was ready to match him. If nobody had interrupted that spiral, we'd be at war again by tomorrow." "How do you know about Captain Sella?" Lyra asked. "That incident wasn't in any human reports I've seen." Daniel smiled slightly. "Because I spent the last 5 years learning everything I could about your military, your culture, and your people. I didn't volunteer for this assignment because I wanted to be a symbol, Princess. I volunteered because I knew I could actually help, if given the chance. That requires knowledge, not just good intentions." Lyra stared at him, reassessing everything she thought she understood. This human wasn't just a soldier playing diplomat. He had been preparing for exactly this kind of moment, studying her people with the same intensity he probably studied enemy tactics. "You've been planning this from the beginning," she said slowly. "The marriage, the alliance, all of it. You saw this as a mission." "Of course," Daniel replied. "What else would it be?" He saw her expression and paused. "Did you think I was here by accident? That I just happened to be the one chosen? Your father picked you because you're smart, capable, and expendable enough to risk on an experiment. My government picked me for the same reasons. We're both tools in a larger game, Lyra. The question is whether we're going to be effective tools or just decorative ones." His honesty was brutal and strangely refreshing. Lyra had spent her entire life navigating the careful lies of court politics, where everyone smiled and hid their true intentions behind layers of protocol. Daniel simply stated facts and let her deal with them. "I don't know if I should be offended or impressed," she said. "Be both," Daniel suggested. "I usually am." He started walking back toward their quarters, and Lyra followed, her mind spinning with new calculations. If Daniel had been preparing for this marriage as a military operation, then she needed to adapt her own approach. He wasn't an enemy, but he wasn't exactly an ally either. He was a partner in a very dangerous mission, and she needed to start treating him as such. That night, instead of retreating to her chamber, Lyra sat in the common area and waited for Daniel to emerge from his room. When he did, carrying another of his portable devices, he paused at seeing her there. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "I want to know what you know," Lyra said, "about my people, about the war, about why you think this marriage matters. You said you've been studying us for 5 years. Teach me what you've learned." Daniel considered her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but it goes both ways. I need to understand the collective better too, and you have access to information I don't. We share intelligence, we pool resources, and we figure out how to make this actually work. Deal?" "Deal," Lyra said, and extended her hand. Daniel shook it, his grip firm and sure, and something settled between them that felt almost like the beginning of real partnership. Over the next 2 weeks, their quarters became a kind of war room. Daniel showed her human tactical analysis of collective fleet movements, pointing out patterns that her own military had missed. Lyra shared political intelligence about the various factions within the Ascended Council, explaining which leaders genuinely wanted peace and which were looking for any excuse to resume the war. They worked late into each night, building a shared understanding of the complex situation they had been thrown into. The joint investigation into the border incident concluded that both sides bore responsibility. The collective patrol captain had been overzealous, but the human freighter had been using outdated navigation codes that made it appear suspicious. Discipline was administered on both sides. Reparations were paid to the families of the dead crew members, and new protocols were established to prevent similar incidents. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and the treaty held. During this time, Lyra began to notice things about Daniel that contradicted her initial assumptions. He was disciplined to an almost inhuman degree, waking at the same time every morning, exercising with brutal efficiency, and maintaining his equipment with obsessive care. But he also had unexpected moments of humour, dry observations that caught her off guard and sometimes made her laugh, despite herself. He was kind to the service staff, learning their names and thanking them in their own languages. He spent hours in meditation, a human practice that looked similar to ascended mental focusing techniques, but served a different purpose. It's about control, Daniel explained when she asked. Humans are emotional creatures. We feel things intensely, and those feelings can cloud judgment. Meditation helps create distance between feeling and action, gives you time to think before you react. The collective teaches that emotions are weaknesses to be suppressed, Lyra said. That's different, Daniel replied. Suppression means pretending they don't exist. That just makes them stronger. I acknowledge what I feel, I examine it, and then I decide if it's useful or not. Fear can keep you alert. Anger can give you strength. Sadness can teach compassion. The emotions themselves aren't the problem. It's letting them control you that causes trouble. It was a subtle distinction, but it changed how Lyra thought about her own emotional training. The collective taught that superior beings transcended base feelings. Daniel suggested that true strength came from understanding and managing them. She found herself wondering which approach was actually more advanced. 3 weeks into the marriage, Lyra's father invited them to a formal dinner with the High Council, the first time Daniel would be presented to the full ruling body of the collective. It was a test, obviously, and a dangerous one. The council included several members who opposed the peace treaty and would be looking for any excuse to discredit it. Lyra briefed Daniel extensively on council politics, explaining the complex web of alliances and rivalries that governed collective leadership. Councillor Moran will try to provoke you, she warned. He lost 2 sons in the war and blames humans for their deaths. He'll want you to lose your temper, to confirm his belief that your people are savage and uncontrollable. Then I won't lose my temper, Daniel said simply, adjusting his dress uniform in the mirror. The formal version included a high collar and silver braiding that made him look more ceremonial but no less military. I've dealt with politicians before. The key is to give them nothing to work with. The dinner was held in the Grand Hall, a massive chamber with walls that displayed real-time imagery of the collective's territory, thousands of star systems represented as points of light. The council members arrived in order of seniority, each wearing robes that indicated their political faction and level of influence. Lyra's father presided from the head of the table, with Lyra and Daniel seated to his right, a position of honour that several councillors noted with barely concealed displeasure. The first half of the dinner passed in careful diplomatic conversation. Council members asked Daniel polite questions about Earth, about human culture, about his military service. He answered with the same careful precision he brought to everything, offering information without revealing anything truly sensitive. Lyra watched Councillor Moran, noting how the old councillor grew increasingly frustrated as Daniel refused to provide any ammunition for criticism. Finally, as dessert was being served, Moran struck. Commander Cross, I wonder if you could explain something to me. Your people claim to value peace, yet your entire history is one of continuous warfare. Your species has nearly destroyed itself multiple times. You've used atomic weapons on your own cities. You've engaged in genocides and atrocities that would shock any civilized race. How are we to trust that your commitment to this peace is genuine and not simply a tactical pause before the next assault? The table went silent. Every council member watched to see how the human would respond. Lyra felt her own hearts accelerate, knowing that this was the moment that could break everything. Daniel set down his utensil carefully, took a sip of water, and met Moran's gaze directly. "You're absolutely right," Daniel said, his voice calm. "Humans have done terrible things to each other. We have a history soaked in blood, and we carry the scars of our mistakes into every generation. We've used weapons that should never have been created. We've killed over differences in ideology, religion, skin color, and resources. We've been, by any objective measure, a disaster of a species." He paused, and Lyra saw several council members nod, satisfied that the human was admitting his people's inferiority. Then Daniel continued, and his voice changed, becoming harder, more focused. "And that is precisely why you should trust us when we say we want peace. Because we know, better than any species, that has only fought external enemies, what war actually costs. We know what it looks like when cities burn. We know the sound children make when they're starving. We know how it feels to stand in the ashes of everything you built and wonder if anything was worth the price. Your people, Councillor Moran, have been at war for 5 years. My people have been at war with ourselves for 5,000 years. We are tired in ways you cannot possibly understand. So when we say we want peace, we mean it with every fibre of our being, because we have paid for that wisdom in more blood than your entire species has ever shed." The silence that followed was absolute. Moran's face had gone pale, and several other councillors shifted uncomfortably. Chancellor Varen watched Daniel with an expression that might have been respect. Lyra realized she was holding her breath and forced herself to exhale slowly. "A pretty speech," Moran finally said, but his voice had lost its aggressive edge. "Words are easy, Commander." "Yes," Daniel agreed, "which is why I'm here, married to a woman I barely know, living among people who consider me a primitive, doing everything I can to make this treaty work. Actions matter more than words, Councillor. Judge me by what I do, not what I say." The dinner concluded shortly after, with council members departing in small groups, their conversations hushed and intense. As Lyra and Daniel left the hall, her father caught Daniel's arm, a familiar gesture that surprised them both. "That was well done," Varan said quietly. "Moran has been my opponent for decades. Few have ever managed to silence him so effectively." "I just told the truth, Chancellor," Daniel replied. "Yes," Varen said. "That's what made it so devastating." He released Daniel's arm and looked at Lyra. "Your mother would have liked him. She always appreciated directness." Then he was gone, leaving them alone in the corridor. Lyra didn't speak until they reached their quarters. Once inside, she rounded on Daniel, her usual composure cracking. "That was incredibly risky. You could have offended the entire council." "Could have," Daniel agreed, removing his formal jacket. "But Moran gave me an opening. He wanted me to defend humanity's honor, to get angry and prove his point about us being savage. Instead, I agreed with him and used our flaws as evidence of our credibility. It's a rhetorical technique called acceptance and reframing. Works well against aggressive interrogators. You manipulated him," Lyra said. "I responded to his attack with truth shaped to serve our purpose," Daniel corrected. "Politics is about framing, Princess. Everyone manipulates everyone. The question is whether you're doing it for selfish reasons or for the greater good." He sat down heavily, and for the first time since they had married, Lyra saw genuine exhaustion in his features. "That dinner took more out of me than a firefight would have. At least in combat, everyone's intentions are clear." Lyra sat across from him, studying her husband with new eyes. "You meant what you said about humans being tired of war." "Every word," Daniel confirmed. "I've served in 3 conflicts before this one. I've killed people whose names I'll never know, for reasons that seemed important at the time, but matter less with each passing year. I'm 38 years old, and I feel ancient. If this marriage can help end even one war, it's worth whatever personal cost it demands. Even being married to an alien you don't love? Daniel smiled, tired but genuine. I don't love you, Lyra. Not yet, maybe not ever, but I respect you. I trust you to hold up your end of this bargain. And in my experience, respect and trust are better foundations for partnership than love anyway. Love makes you stupid. Respect keeps you sharp. It should have been insulting, but somehow it wasn't. Lyra found herself appreciating his honesty more than any false declaration of affection. My people would say that emotions are weaknesses, that a marriage based on logic and duty is superior to one based on feeling. Your people are lying to themselves, Daniel said bluntly. Everyone feels. The Ascended just pretend they don't because it makes you feel superior. But I've watched your father when he talks about your mother. I've seen your sister worry about you. I've noticed how you touch that pendant on your neck when you're nervous. You all feel deeply. You've just been trained to hide it. The difference between us is that humans admit we're emotional creatures and work with it. You pretend you're above it and let those hidden emotions control you from the shadows. Lyra's hand had indeed moved to the pendant, a gift from her mother before she died. She forced herself to lower it. You're very observant. It's kept me alive, Daniel replied. He stood, stretching. I'm going to sleep. Tomorrow's going to be complicated. The council will be reconvening to discuss border expansions, and both sides have strong opinions about that. We should prepare. As he moved towards his chamber, Lyra called out, Daniel? He paused, looking back. Thank you. For tonight. For not making things worse. That's what partners do, he said, and disappeared into his room. Lyra sat alone in the common area for a long time after, turning Daniel's words over in her mind. He was right about the collective's emotional dishonesty. She had been trained her entire life to suppress feelings, to present a serene exterior regardless of internal turmoil. But watching Daniel navigate the dinner with such skill, she realized that he had access to information she didn't. He could read emotional currents in the room because he acknowledged they existed. He could predict reactions because he understood what drove people beyond just logic. Perhaps the humans' acceptance of their own nature wasn't a weakness after all. Perhaps it was a different kind of strength, one the collective had never developed because they refused to admit they needed it. She touched her pendant again, this time deliberately. Remembering her mother's face, the grief was still there, sharp and immediate, even years later. The collective would say she should have transcended that pain by now. Daniel would probably say the pain itself was information, a reminder of love and loss that made her stronger for acknowledging it. She wasn't sure which philosophy was correct, but she was beginning to suspect that the truth lay somewhere between them, in a synthesis neither species had achieved alone. The border expansion talks began the next morning, and immediately proved as contentious as Daniel had predicted. The collective wanted to extend their territory into 3 systems that humans considered within their sphere of influence. The human delegation argued that these systems had been explored and mapped by human ships first, giving them priority claim. Both sides brought reams of data, historical records and legal arguments. The meeting devolved into shouting within the first hour, with translators struggling to keep up with the rapid-fire exchanges in multiple languages. Lyra and Daniel sat in the observation gallery, watching the chaos unfold below them. They had no official role in the negotiations. Their presence was purely symbolic, a reminder to both sides that cooperation was possible. But as the arguments grew more heated and personal, Lyra saw Daniel lean forward, his attention sharpening. They're not arguing about the systems, he murmured. Watch Admiral Torin. See how he keeps glancing at Councillor Vara, and Vara keeps deferring to him. There's something else happening here. Lyra followed his gaze and saw what he meant. The public arguments were about territory, but the body language suggested a deeper agenda. She accessed her datapad, pulling up intelligence reports on both Torin and Vara. What she found made her curse in 3 languages. Torin has family ties to mining interests in those systems, she said quietly, and Vara sits on the Economic Council that regulates resource extraction. This isn't about strategy, it's about profit. Same on our side, Daniel replied, checking his own device. Ambassador Hayes has connections to 3 different corporations that want access to the rare earth deposits in those systems. This whole negotiation is just theatre, so both sides can position themselves to make money off whatever compromise gets reached. They looked at each other, and Lyra saw her own frustration reflected in Daniel's expression. "We could expose them," she said. "We could," Daniel agreed, "but that would embarrass your father and my government at the same time. It might derail the entire peace process. The question is whether we want to be right or whether we want to be effective." Lyra considered the problem, running through scenarios and outcomes. If they exposed the corruption, they would damage both governments' credibility, but might force more honest negotiations. If they stayed silent, the corrupt officials would profit, but the treaty would survive intact. Neither option was good, but one was clearly worse. "We need a third option," she said. "Something that addresses the corruption without destroying the treaty." Daniel thought for a moment, then smiled slightly. "What if we didn't expose the corruption directly? What if we just made it impossible for them to profit from it?" He explained his idea quickly, and Lyra felt a fierce satisfaction as she understood what he was suggesting. It was risky and required them to act without approval from their respective governments, but it was elegant in its simplicity. They spent the rest of the day preparing, gathering information, and building their case. That night, they drafted a proposal together, refining the language until it said exactly what they needed it to say. The next morning, before the negotiations could resume, Lyra and Daniel requested time to address both delegations. Chancellor Veran looked surprised but granted the request. They stood together at the center of the chamber, every eye in the room focused on them. "We've been listening to the arguments about the 3 disputed systems," Lyra began, her voice clear and formal, "and we believe there's a solution that serves everyone's interests better than endless debate over territorial claims." Daniel continued seamlessly, their presentation obviously rehearsed. "We propose that all 3 systems be declared joint territories, governed equally by both collective and human authorities. All resource extraction would be regulated by a combined oversight committee, with profits split evenly and used to fund reconstruction in war-damaged regions. This ensures that neither side can exploit the resources for private gain, and it creates an incentive for both governments to maintain peace, since war would threaten the revenue stream." The chamber erupted. Admiral Torrin stood, his face flushing with anger. "This is outrageous. You presume to rewrite territorial policy without consultation? We presume to offer a solution that benefits our peoples rather than specific individuals," Lyra replied calmly, "unless the Admiral has a reason to prefer exclusive control that he'd like to share with the Council." The trap was sprung. If Torrin continued to object too strongly, he would have to explain why shared oversight was unacceptable, potentially revealing his financial interests. If he backed down, the proposal would move forward. Lyra watched him calculate the odds, saw the moment he realized he had been outmaneuvered, and felt no sympathy whatsoever. Ambassador Hayes stood as well, his expression carefully neutral. "This is an interesting proposal. My government would need time to review the details." "Of course," Daniel said. "We've prepared full documentation, including precedents from both human and collective history where joint governance has been successful. We're not demanding immediate acceptance. We're simply suggesting that this approach might serve everyone's interests better than continued argument over exclusive claims." The discussions that followed lasted 3 more days, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Once Lyra and Daniel had publicly proposed shared governance, neither side could reject it without appearing unreasonable or greedy. The final agreement included most of their suggestions, with minor modifications to save face for both delegations. When the treaty was signed, Chancellor Veran personally thanked them both, though Lyra noticed her father's eyes held a mixture of pride and wariness. They had demonstrated initiative and competence, but they had also shown they were willing to act independently. That made them valuable, but also potentially dangerous. That night, back in their quarters, Daniel poured 2 glasses of human whiskey, something he had requested from the commissary. He handed one to Lyra, who examined it suspiciously. "It's a tradition," Daniel explained. When soldiers accomplish a mission together, they drink to the success and to the partnership. You don't have to if you don't want to. Lyra took the glass and sipped cautiously. The liquid burned, going down, harsh and unpleasant, but she understood the ritual. To uncomfortable alliances, she said, raising the glass. To effective partnerships, Daniel corrected, touching his glass to hers. They drank, and Lyra managed not to cough at the taste. Daniel smiled at her expression. It's an acquired taste. Everything about humans seems to be an acquired taste, Lyra replied, but there was no hostility in her voice. They had worked well together over the past days, anticipating each other's thoughts, covering each other's weaknesses. It was the kind of combat synchronization her military training had emphasized, but she had never expected to achieve it with an alien husband in a political arena rather than a battlefield. I've been thinking, Daniel said, settling into his usual chair. We've been reactive so far, responding to crises and problems as they arise. But if we want to really make a difference, we need to be proactive. We need to start building something positive, not just preventing disasters. What did you have in mind? Lyra asked, intrigued, despite herself. Cultural exchange, Daniel said. Real exchange, not just diplomatic ceremonies. Get collective citizens and human citizens actually interacting, learning about each other, building relationships. Right now, most of what both sides know about each other comes from wartime propaganda. We need to change that narrative. It was a good idea, perhaps even a brilliant one. But Lyra immediately saw the obstacles. Both governments would resist. They're comfortable with the current distance. Real cultural exchange would create unpredictable social changes, which is exactly why it's necessary, Daniel argued. Peace treaties last only as long as governments want them to last. Cultural connections are harder to break. If we can get enough ordinary people invested in this peace, it becomes much harder for politicians to resume hostilities. They spent the next several weeks developing the proposal, working with contacts on both sides to build support. Daniel revealed a talent for building coalitions, identifying key figures who could be convinced to support their initiative, and crafting arguments tailored to each person's specific concerns. Lyra contributed her understanding of collective social dynamics and her family connections, opening doors that would have been closed to a human operating alone. Together they created a framework for student exchanges, cultural festivals, joint scientific projects, and trade relationships that would bypass government control and put humans and collective citizens in direct contact with each other. The proposal faced resistance from predictable quarters, but it also found unexpected supporters. Some councillors who had been skeptical of the peace treaty saw cultural exchange as a way to demonstrate collective superiority and agreed to participate, thinking it would prove their civilization's advancement. Human corporations saw profit opportunities and pushed their government representatives to approve the programs. Within 2 months, the first exchange students were selected, the first joint art exhibition was being planned, and the first collaborative research station was under construction in neutral space. Lyra and Daniel attended the opening ceremony for the research station, watching as human and collective scientists worked side by side to activate the facility's primary systems. She noticed Daniel smiling, a genuine expression of satisfaction. "You look pleased," she observed. "This is what peace actually looks like," Daniel replied. "Not treaties and ceremonies, but people working together on something constructive. When I was fighting in the war, I used to imagine what would happen if we could redirect all that intelligence and effort into building instead of destroying. This is a start. You're an idealist," Lyra said, surprised by the realization. "Under all the tactical thinking and military discipline, you actually believe in something, doesn't everyone?" Daniel asked. "You volunteered for this marriage because you believed it could make a difference. That's idealism too. We just hide it behind practical concerns and strategic thinking because admitting we care makes us vulnerable." It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her, and Lyra felt something shift in her understanding of the man she had married. He wasn't just a soldier following orders or a diplomat playing a role. He genuinely wanted to make the universe better, even if he would never phrase it that way. "I think I'm starting to understand why your people fight so effectively," she said quietly. It's not just the desperation you mentioned. It's because you believe in things worth fighting for. The collective fights to maintain our superiority, to preserve our way of life. But humans fight for ideas, for possibilities, for the future you want to create. That's a much more powerful motivation. Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. That's probably the most insightful thing anyone from the collective has ever said about us. Most of your people just think we're barbaric and stubborn.
You are barbaric and stubborn, Lyra replied.
But you're also passionate and creative and persistent in ways that we've trained ourselves not to be. The collective teaches that we've evolved beyond base emotions and primitive drives, but maybe we've evolved past some things that were actually useful. They stood together, watching the research station come fully online, its lights bright against the darkness of space. For the first time since their marriage, Lyra felt something that might have been hope. Not hope that the marriage would become something it wasn't, but hope that their partnership could actually achieve the things they had been working toward. The next crisis came without warning, as the worst ones always do. 3 months after the research station opened, a human civilian transport was destroyed near collective space. All 200 passengers were killed instantly. The initial reports were chaotic and contradictory. Human authorities claimed it was a collective attack. Collective scanners showed no military vessels in the area. Within hours, both sides were accusing the other of lying, and the carefully constructed peace began to fracture again. Lyra and Daniel were woken by emergency alerts in the middle of the night cycle. They met in the common area, both still in sleep clothing, but instantly alert. Daniel was already accessing news feeds and military channels on his portable devices. "What do we know?" Lyra asked, pulling up her own information sources. "Not enough," Daniel replied grimly. The transport was the Meridian, carrying mostly civilian contractors and their families. It was in neutral space, following approved trade routes. Then something hit it hard enough to cause immediate catastrophic failure. No distress signal, no survivors, nothing. Collective sensors would have detected any weapons fire, Lyra said, reading through the technical reports. Our monitoring systems cover that entire region. If one of our ships fired on the transport, we would have the data. Unless the data was suppressed, Daniel pointed out, or unless it wasn't a collective ship. They looked at each other, the same terrible thought occurring to both simultaneously. "A third party," Lyra said. "Someone who wants to restart the war." "It's the oldest trick in the book," Daniel agreed. "Create an incident. Blame it on your enemy. Let them tear each other apart while you profit from the chaos. The question is, who benefits from renewed human collective conflict? They spent the rest of the night investigating, pulling files and contacts, building a picture of who might have the means and motive to destroy a civilian transport. The list was disturbingly long. Several species had been displaced by the expanding human collective conflict and would love to see both sides weaken each other further. Weapons manufacturers on both sides would profit enormously from renewed warfare. Extremist factions in both governments had opposed the peace treaty from the beginning. By morning they had narrowed the possibilities but had no definitive proof. They brought their findings to an emergency meeting of the Joint Diplomatic Council, where tensions were already explosive. Human representatives were demanding access to collective military records. Collective councillors were insisting that humans were fabricating the incident as an excuse for aggression. No one was listening to anyone else. Daniel stood, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Everyone stop!" The command in his tone was absolute, the voice of an officer who expected to be obeyed. The room fell silent. "Before we tear apart this peace over assumptions and accusations, we need to consider the possibility that neither of our governments destroyed that transport. We need to investigate who actually benefits from this tragedy, because I promise you, it's not us." "You're suggesting a conspiracy?" Admiral Torrin said skeptically, a convenient excuse to avoid accountability. "I'm suggesting we use basic tactical analysis before committing to a course of action," Daniel replied. "When something doesn't make sense, when the evidence contradicts what should be obvious, you look for alternative explanations. The collective had no tactical reason to destroy a civilian transport. Doing so violates the treaty. risks war, and gains them nothing. So either your military command has become suicidally stupid in the past 3 months, or someone else pulled the trigger. Lyra stood as well, adding her voice to Daniel's cough. The same logic applies to human forces. You had no reason to sacrifice your own civilians to create an incident, which means we're looking for a third actor, someone with the capability to destroy a transport and the motive to frame it as a human collective conflict. And you have evidence of this mysterious third party? Councillor Vara asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. We have analysis, Lyra replied. And we have a list of suspects. The Xarnex Consortium has been conducting weapons tests in adjacent sectors. The Creel Empire lost territory when we established our border treaty. Several privateer groups operate in that region and would benefit from increased chaos. We're not asking you to take our word for anything. We're asking you to investigate before you start a war that might be exactly what our real enemies want. The debate continued for hours, but eventually pragmatism won out over outrage. A joint investigation team was assembled, with representatives from both human and collective military intelligence. Daniel volunteered to participate, and Lyra insisted on joining him. If they were going to prevent a war, they needed to be directly involved in finding the truth. The investigation took them to the edge of mapped space, interviewing witnesses, examining debris, and reconstructing the final moments of the Meridian. What they found was damning. The weapon signature didn't match human or collective technology. The attack vector suggested the shooter had been positioned in a location that neither side regularly patrolled. Most tellingly, they found fragments of a guidance system in the debris that was manufactured by the Creel Empire, a hostile neighbour that both humans and the collective had pushed back during the war. The Creel have been quiet for the past year, Daniel said, examining the evidence in the investigation team's secure facility. We assumed they were licking their wounds after we handed them that defeat in the Outer Rim. But what if they've been preparing a different kind of attack? Instead of fighting us directly, they make us fight each other. It's effective, Lyra admitted, and cheaper than a direct military campaign. One destroyed transport could have sparked a war that would have devastated both our species, leaving the Creel free to reclaim lost territory and expand further. They presented their findings to the Joint Council backed by physical evidence and expert testimony. The reaction was a mixture of relief and rage. Relief that the peace could be preserved, rage that another species had tried to manipulate them into self-destruction. Within days, a joint human collective task force was assembled to deal with the Creel threat. For the first time since making contact, the two species were working together against a common enemy rather than fighting each other. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. It had taken the threat of a third party to finally unite them in common cause. Lyra and Daniel watched the task force deploy from the observation deck of the diplomatic station, massive warships from both fleets moving in coordinated formations. We're not good at peace, Daniel observed. We're much better at war. At least war gives us a clear enemy and obvious objectives. Then we need to get better at peace, Lyra replied, because war, even against a common enemy, is still just destruction. The research station, the cultural exchanges, the joint governance projects, those are what actually matter. Those are what build a future worth having. Daniel smiled at her, and she realized it was the first time she had seen him look genuinely happy. When did you become the idealist? When I married one, Lyra replied. It's apparently contagious. The task force's campaign against the Creel was swift and decisive. Fighting together, human adaptability and collective technological superiority proved an unstoppable combination. The Creel had expected to face divided enemies, still rebuilding from their own conflict. Instead, they encountered coordinated attacks from forces that had spent 5 years learning how to fight each other and had now turned that knowledge against a common threat. Within 6 months, the Creel Empire had sued for peace and withdrawn to their original borders, thoroughly defeated. The victory had unexpected consequences. The joint military operations had forced human and collective personnel to work closely together, breaking down the remaining barriers between the two species. Soldiers who had fought against each other 5 years ago now trained together, shared tactics, and built friendships. The cultural exchange programs exploded in popularity as both populations became fascinated with their former enemies. The research station spawned 3 more cooperative facilities. Trade increased exponentially as both sides discovered the benefits of combining their different technological approaches. Lyra and Daniel found themselves in the strange position of being credited as architects of the new alliance, despite knowing that most of it had happened despite rather than because of their planning. Their marriage, originally a cynical political arrangement, had become a symbol of what cooperation could achieve. They gave speeches, attended ceremonies, and met with endless delegations of diplomats and military officers. Through it all, their partnership deepened. They developed a shorthand communication, able to convey complex ideas with a glance or gesture. They learned to trust each other's judgment completely, knowing that whatever challenges arose, they would face them together. What had started as strategic cooperation evolved into genuine friendship. 2 very different people who had discovered they worked better together than apart. One evening, nearly a year after their wedding, they sat together on the balcony of their quarters, watching the sunset paint the sky in colours that existed nowhere on Earth or the collective homeworld. It was a view unique to this diplomatic station, this artificial creation that represented the space between 2 civilizations. "I've been offered a promotion," Daniel said quietly. "They want me to take command of the Joint Task Force operations. It would mean more responsibility, more travel, probably less time here. Will you take it?" Lyra asked, though she already knew the answer. "I think I should," Daniel replied. "The task force needs someone who understands both human and collective tactics, someone both sides trust, and honestly, I'm more useful out there than I am standing around at ceremonies." "I could come with you," Lyra offered. "I'm not doing much here that couldn't be handled by other diplomats. And someone needs to make sure you don't start any diplomatic incidents." Daniel looked at her, surprised. "You'd leave the capital? Your family? Everything familiar?" "I volunteered to marry an alien and leave everything familiar a year ago," Lyra pointed out. "This would just be more of the same. Besides, someone needs to document how the joint operations actually work. Create a record for future cooperation. I'm probably the best qualified person to do that. We'd be traveling constantly," Daniel warned, "living on military vessels, dealing with combat situations. It's not going to be comfortable or safe." "I didn't marry you for comfort or safety," Lyra replied. "I married you to help build peace between our peoples. If that work is happening on the task force vessels now, that's where I need to be." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun disappear below the horizon. Finally, Daniel spoke again, his voice softer than usual. "You know, when I volunteered for this assignment, I thought it would be the hardest thing I'd ever done. Living with an alien wife, navigating 2 cultures, trying to prevent a war with nothing but a symbolic marriage as a tool. I was prepared for it to be miserable." "And?" Lyra prompted. "It hasn't been," Daniel admitted. "You've surprised me at every turn. You're smarter than most of the officers I've served with, braver than you probably should be, and willing to call me on my mistakes in ways that actually make me better at what I do. I don't love you, Lyra. I'm not going to pretend I do, but I respect the hell out of you, and I'm genuinely glad you're my partner in this." It should have stung, that clear statement that he didn't love her, but somehow it didn't, because Lyra realized she felt exactly the same way. "I don't love you either," she said honestly, "but I trust you completely, and I can't imagine trying to do this work with anyone else. Maybe that's not the kind of marriage either of us imagined having, but it works." "It does work," Daniel agreed, "which is more than most marriages can claim, from what I understand." They accepted the new assignments together and left the diplomatic station 3 weeks later. The next 2 years were a blur of travel, combat, negotiation, and crisis management. They visited dozens of worlds, met thousands of people, and helped establish the frameworks that would govern human collective cooperation for generations. They survived 3 assassination attempts, prevented 2 wars, and somehow found time to co-author a tactical manual on combined species operations that became required reading at military academies on both sides. Through it all, they remained partners in the truest sense. Not romantic partners, but something perhaps more rare and valuable. Two people who had been thrown together by politics and circumstance, who had chosen to make the best of an impossible situation, and who had discovered that the best of impossible was actually pretty damn good. On the second anniversary of their wedding, they found themselves back at the diplomatic station for a mandatory ceremony celebrating the alliance. The station had grown significantly, now hosting permanent delegations from a dozen species, and serving as the de facto capital of the emerging multi-species coalition. As they stood together for yet another round of photographs and speeches, Lyra leaned close to Daniel and whispered, "Volunteering for this?" Daniel considered the question seriously, as he always did. "There are easier lives I could have had," he admitted, "but I don't think there are better ones. What we've built, what we're still building, it matters. That's worth more than comfort or simplicity." "Even though you're married to an alien who drives you crazy?" Lyra asked with a slight smile. "Especially because of that," Daniel replied. "You keep me from getting too comfortable, too confident in my own assumptions. That's valuable in ways I'm still discovering." After the ceremony, they escaped to their old quarters, which had been maintained for their use whenever they visited. The space felt smaller now, after living on various ships and stations, but it was also familiar, comfortable in a way that surprised them both. "I've been thinking," Lyra said, settling into what had once been her favourite chair, "about what you said when we first married, that humans are tired of fighting in ways the collective couldn't understand. I think I understand it now, a little bit. After 2 years of constant travel and crisis management, I'm tired too. Not the physical exhaustion that rest can cure. A deeper tiredness, the kind that comes from always being on guard, always preparing for the next disaster." "Welcome to the human condition," Daniel said with dark humour. "That tiredness is why we fight so hard for peace, because we know what the alternative costs, and we're done paying that price." "But you're not done," Lyra observed. "You keep going, keep working, keep pushing for a better future, even though you're exhausted. That's what I didn't understand at first. It's not that humans don't feel the weight of everything. You feel it more than we do. You just refuse to let it stop you." "Stubbornness," Daniel said, "probably our most defining trait." "Resilience," Lyra corrected. "The ability to keep going when any rational being would stop. That's why even gods would fear your kind, Daniel. Not because humans are the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but because you don't quit, ever. You just keep coming, keep adapting, keep fighting for what you believe in until either you win or you're dead. And sometimes not even then." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Is that what you've learned from being married to me? That humans are just too stubborn to know when we're beaten?" "I've learned that stubbornness and determination are the same thing, viewed from different perspectives," Lyra replied. "The collective spent 5 years trying to defeat humans through superior technology and tactics. We never understood that we were fighting an enemy that defines itself by refusing to be defeated. You don't need to be stronger if you're willing to outlast your opponent. You don't need to be smarter if you're willing to learn from every mistake and try again. The collective gave up when the cost exceeded the benefit. Humans just changed their approach and kept going." "That analysis would have been useful 5 years ago," Daniel said dryly. 5 years ago, I wouldn't have understood it," Lyra admitted. "I had to see it firsthand, had to work beside you and watch how you approach every problem. The collective teaches that there's a rational limit to effort, a point where continued struggle becomes illogical. But humans don't accept that limit. You push past rational into something else, something that shouldn't work, but does because you believe it will. We call it hope," Daniel said quietly, "the irrational belief that things can get better if you just keep working at it. It's probably humanity's greatest weakness and our greatest strength at the same time. It's why gods would fear you," Lyra repeated, "because gods are supposed to be beyond challenge, beyond defeat. But humans don't believe in anything being beyond challenge. You would fight a god the same way you fight anything else, looking for weaknesses, adapting your tactics, refusing to surrender no matter how hopeless it seemed. And eventually, impossibly, you might actually win. Not because you're more powerful, but because you're too stupid or too stubborn or too hopeful to recognize when you should quit. Daniel laughed, genuine amusement lighting his features, as possibly the most backhanded compliment I've ever received. Too stupid to quit, therefore dangerous to gods. It wasn't meant as an insult, Lyra said seriously. I'm trying to explain what I've learned about humans, about you specifically. The collective defines advancement as transcending base instincts and primitive drives. We believe that evolution means leaving behind the irrational parts of our nature. But watching humans, watching you, I've realized that maybe those irrational parts are what make a species truly dangerous. Logic has limits. Reason has boundaries. But hope, determination, stubbornness, those things are limitless. They let you attempt the impossible and occasionally succeed. You're saying the collective's philosophy is wrong, Daniel said. It wasn't a question. I'm saying it's incomplete, Lyra replied carefully. We're right that logic and reason are important. We're right that controlling emotions leads to better decision-making in most situations. But we're wrong to think that transcending our nature entirely is the path to true advancement. Humans have taught me that the key is integration, not elimination. You don't deny your emotions. You channel them. You don't ignore your instincts. You refine them. The result is messy and imperfect, but it's also more adaptable, more resilient, and ultimately more successful than our approach of pure rationality. Daniel stood and moved to the window, looking out at the station's central plaza, where humans and collective citizens mixed freely, the sight that would have been impossible 3 years ago.
You know what the hardest part of this assignment has been? He asked.
It's not the combat, or the politics, or even being married to an alien. It's realizing that both our species are wrong about fundamental things, and we're only going to survive if we're willing to learn from each other. Humans need to learn some of the collective's discipline and long-term thinking. The collective needs to learn some of humanity's flexibility and emotional intelligence. Neither approach is sufficient alone. That's what we've been building, Lyra said, joining him at the window. A synthesis, taking the best of both species and creating something new. Our marriage was supposed to be symbolic, but maybe it's actually predictive. Human determination combined with collective strategic thinking. Human passion combined with collective discipline. That's what the Alliance is becoming, a hybrid of both philosophies. And that hybrid is what's making other species nervous, Daniel observed. I've seen the intelligence reports. The Zanari Federation, the Torvan hegemony, even some of the neutral powers are watching the human collective alliance with concern. They're worried about what happens when two species that recently fought each other suddenly start working together. They're worried that synthesis you're talking about will make us too powerful to challenge. Let them worry, Lyra said firmly. We're not building this alliance to threaten anyone. We're building it because it works, because it creates something better than either of us had alone. If that makes other species uncomfortable, they can either learn to adapt or learn to cooperate. Those are the only options that don't end in conflict. Spoken like a human, Daniel said with approval. See, you're learning. They spent the rest of their visit at the station reviewing progress reports and meeting with various diplomatic and military teams. Everywhere they went, they saw evidence of the cultural synthesis they had discussed. Human officers training collective soldiers in adaptive tactics, collective engineers teaching humans about quantum field manipulation, mixed species crews on vessels that combine technology from both civilizations, art galleries featuring works that blended human emotional expression with collective mathematical precision. It wasn't perfect, and there were still plenty of conflicts and misunderstandings, but the overall trend was undeniable. Two species were learning to work together, and the results were extraordinary. On their last night at the station, they attended a small gathering hosted by some of the exchange students who had been part of the original cultural exchange program. These young people, human and collective alike, had grown up during the war, but were now building friendships and partnerships across species lines. Watching them interact, easy and natural with each other, Lyra felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was what they had been working toward, a generation that would see cooperation as normal rather than exceptional. A young collective woman named Sarah approached them, her formal robes marked with the symbols of advanced academic achievement. "Ambassador Lyra, Commander Daniel, I wanted to thank you both. My doctoral research focuses on hybrid tactical systems, combining human and collective military theory. Your work made that possible. Without the alliance, without your marriage demonstrating that cooperation was viable, I wouldn't have been allowed to even propose such research." "What have you discovered?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious. Sarah's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "That both species have been operating under unnecessary constraints. Humans assume certain things are impossible because they lack the technology. The collective assumes certain approaches are inefficient because they require emotional engagement. But when you combine human creative problem-solving with collective technological capabilities, you get solutions neither species would have developed alone. I've designed 3 new weapons systems, 2 defensive protocols, and a completely new approach to fleet coordination, all based on hybrid principles." "That's excellent work," Lyra said warmly. "Have you published yet?" "Next month," Sarah replied, "and I've already had interest from both military academies about coming to teach. 5 years ago, I would have been training to fight humans. Now I'm training to fight alongside them. It's strange and wonderful at the same time." After Sarah moved on to talk with other guests, Daniel leaned close to Lyra. "That's the real victory. Not the battles we won or the treaties we signed, but the fact that young people like her can imagine a future we couldn't 3 years ago." "We did that," Lyra said quietly, "you and I, along with thousands of others, but we were part of it. We helped make that future possible." "We did," Daniel agreed, "and we're not done yet. There's still a lot of work to do, a lot of species that need to be brought into the fold, a lot of old hatreds that need to heal. But looking at people like Sarah, I think we're going to succeed. It'll take time, maybe decades, but we're building something that will last." They left the station the next morning, returning to their duties with the Joint Task Force. The work continued, crisis after crisis, challenge after challenge, but they faced it all together. 2 very different beings who had learned to trust each other completely. 5 years after their wedding, the Terran Council and the Ascended Collective formally merged their governments, creating the United Systems Alliance. It was a political structure that would have been unthinkable when Lyra and Daniel first married, but by then it felt almost inevitable. The 2 species had become so intertwined, so dependent on each other, that formal unity was simply acknowledging reality. Lyra and Daniel attended the founding ceremony, standing among thousands of other people who had worked to make it possible. They held no special position in the new government, had no particular authority beyond their reputations. But when the new president, a human named Carter Mills, and the new chancellor, a collective leader named Torrin's daughter Kessa, both mentioned the marriage that had started it all, the crowd erupted in applause that went on for several minutes. Afterwards, as they left the ceremony, Daniel took Lyra's hand, a gesture they rarely engaged in unless cameras were present. She looked at him, surprised. "What's that for?" she asked. "Just felt right," Daniel replied. "We've been partners for 5 years. We've built something that's going to outlast us both. I figured we could hold hands to celebrate that without it having to mean something we're not." Lyra smiled and squeezed his hand. "Fair enough. To partnership then." "To partnership," Daniel echoed. "And to the future we're building, one impossible day at a time." They walked together through the crowded streets of the new Alliance capital, 2 beings who had married as symbols and become something much more valuable. They were proof that cooperation was possible, that differences could be strengths rather than weaknesses, and that sometimes the most important relationships were the ones built on respect and trust rather than love. In the years that followed, they continued their work, helping to integrate new species into the Alliance, developing new frameworks for cooperation, and occasionally preventing the wars that threatened to tear apart what they had built. They never became romantic partners, never developed the kind of love story that people seemed to expect from them. But what they had was in many ways more rare and more valuable. A partnership between equals who chose each other repeatedly, day after day, year after year, because together they could accomplish things neither could achieve alone. Lyra often thought about that first conversation. when Daniel had asked what she had learned from marrying a human. The answer had evolved over the years, becoming richer and more complex. She had learned that strength came in many forms, that hope was a weapon more powerful than any technology, and that humanity's refusal to accept defeat was indeed something that even gods might fear. But more than that, she had learned that the most important victories weren't won on battlefields or in council chambers. They were won in the quiet moments when two different beings chose to trust each other, to work together despite every reason not to, and to build something new from the wreckage of old conflicts. Daniel, for his part, learned that the collective's philosophy of transcendence wasn't weakness, as he had initially thought. It was a different kind of strength, the discipline to think long-term, to plan centuries ahead, to value stability over immediate gratification. He learned that sometimes the most radical thing you could do was compromise, that victory didn't always mean getting your way, and that the aliens humans had feared and fought were really just people trying to navigate an impossible universe with the tools they had available. Together they learned that peace was harder than war, that building was more difficult than destroying, and that the most important battles were fought not against external enemies, but against internal prejudices and assumptions. They learned that love wasn't necessary for a successful partnership, but respect, trust, and shared purpose absolutely were. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, now both older and marked by years of constant work, they stood together on a clifftop on a human colony world, watching 3 suns set in a sky that painted impossible colors across alien clouds. The colony was one of hundreds that had been established in jointly claimed territory, places where humans and collective citizens lived and worked side by side, as naturally as breathing. "Do you remember when you asked me if I regretted volunteering?" Daniel said, breaking a comfortable silence. 10 years later, I have a better answer. I don't regret it. I would do it again, exactly the same way, because it led to this, to everything we've built, to who I've become through working with you. I was terrified when we married, Lara admitted. Terrified of humans, terrified of failure, terrified of being alone among aliens who might hurt me. I never imagined that 10 years later I would consider a human my closest ally, my most trusted partner, and possibly my best friend. It's strange how things work out. Not strange, Daniel replied. Inevitable, maybe. We were both shaped by impossible circumstances into people capable of doing impossible things. When you put 2 impossible people together and give them an impossible task, sometimes they accomplish it. The universe makes more sense than we give it credit for. They stood together as the last sun disappeared below the horizon and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, human constellations and collective star charts both visible in the same night. They had been married for 10 years, but had never shared a bed, never exchanged romantic words, never pretended to be something they weren't. Yet the bond between them was stronger than many love stories, forged in crisis and hardship, and the shared satisfaction of work that mattered. That night, in quarters they shared on the colony base, they reviewed reports and planned their next initiatives with the same efficient partnership they had developed years ago. To any outside observer, they might have seemed more like business partners or military comrades than a married couple. But they knew better. They knew that what they had was precious and rare, a relationship defined not by convention or expectation, but by what actually worked for them. Years later, historians would study their marriage as the symbolic foundation of the alliance, analyzing every decision and conversation for hidden meaning. They would miss the truth, because the truth was simple. 2 people from different species had been forced into an arrangement neither wanted, had chosen to make the best of it, rather than merely endure it, and had discovered along the way that the best of impossible was actually extraordinary. The universe would continue to spin, species would continue to struggle and cooperate, and occasionally war with each other, and the alliance would face challenges that made the human collective conflict seem simple by comparison. But the foundation had been laid by countless people working toward a better future, and among them, 2 unlikely partners who had learned that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe wasn't love or technology or military might, but the stubborn refusal to give up on the possibility of peace, one impossible day at a time.